To understand how a natural disaster can be gendered and then sexually admonished, as was Hurricane Katrina, it is important to understand the prevailing tropes and ideologies that allow such discourses to take root. When dealing with an American historical context, we need only trace back a few hundred years. However, the discourses that arose during and after Hurricane Katrina were strongly influenced by the Christian belief of Genesis, and man's downfall due to Eve's carnalities, which, unsurprisingly, was used as a guiding reference for the Puritans populating the Eden-like Americas in the 1600s. In many 17th and 18th century depictions of Eden, Eve stands above Adam as if she is more comfortable than he, who sits somewhat awkwardly against the tree at the edge of the garden. Eve explores with wide, confident movements as if they are within her domain. Of course, we know how this story ends, and her naturalness in these paintings is foreboding of her eternal natural sinner status. These images are mimicked in depictions of European discovery of America during the same eras. As explored in the myths that made America, gendering the newly discovered land as female contextualizes the traveller's relationship to the land as a sexualized encounter, in which the traveller takes natural possession of a feminine, virginal space. These images were painted in the early 1600s by Flemish, Austrian and American artists, indicating that land as female and female as nature may have been a dominant ideology created, perpetuated and legitimizing of American and African colonization. In this narrative, man wields his physical power over the wild land, or woman, who, as he would have it, wants to provide due to her maternal nature. However, as indicated by the natives roasting a human leg in the far background, America was not a virgin land. It was already inhabited by native tribes. And so, to make a genocide more palatable to European sensibilities, America was then repackaged as a damsel who needed rescuing from the savages who threatened her sanctity. The Pocahontas story, whether distorted by Disney or truthfully recounted by historians, continues to serve the purpose of legitimizing or authenticating European colonization. Pocahontas, the noble savage, took the side of the British, was baptized and married an Englishman, adopting a new name and identity as testament to the colonizers' success of taming the virgin land. This role earned her the title of the Mother of America, as if it was via her her intervention that European man could settle and thrive in the Americas. In the Disney adaptation of the legend, the metaphor of Pocahontas as nature, or America, is thinly veiled, demonstrating the perpetuated ideology of nature as inherently female, and therefore man is forever responsible for nature's unstable sensibilities. During the painting of these images, just after the death of Pocahontas, the Puritans had settled in New England, and the witch trials had begun. This gynocide, as some call it, was due to perpetuated fear of the unknown whilst establishing themselves within their own Eden, in which, biblically speaking, they would experience a downfall brought by Eve's sin. This caused a fear of women indicated by an earlier quote, "All witchcraft comes from carnal lust, which, in women, is insatiable." Indeed, Mariana Puglisi and William Burns recount Freud's theories of emasculation as women are unknown and indefinable beings, driven by carnal urges such as copulation, birth, and breastfeeding. These carnal urges, which in reality are natural elements of reproduction, are assigned solely to women, perpetuating the idea that women are more natural, carnal, than men, and therein are closer to the devil, as was Eve. Nature, sex, and the innocent sinner are all tropes of long-standing patriarchal hegemony over women. One platform in which this patriarchy reveals itself is through the representations of natural disaster. When natural disasters are prescribed female names or attributes, the discourse that arises is naturally that of Eve, Mother Nature, and the emasculating sexualized female.
Historically, the true nature of hegemony is revealed during times of crisis. The world's first true international hegemonic power was the British Empire, which was essentially ended by the crisis of the First World War. More recently, the 2008 financial crisis revealed the hegemonic relationship that the world's economic fortunes have with neoliberal ideology. Hegemony functions by forcing colonialist patriarchal ideas on society, which then reveal themselves during times of crisis, and Hurricane Katrina was no different. In his 1993 thesis on the subject, Mike Donaldson gave an account of hegemonic masculinity which applies rather well to the US. Donaldson characterised hegemonic masculinity as, variously, socially and hierarchically exclusive, concerned with money, anxiety-producing, brutal and violent, tough, rich and socially sustained. I won't comment on the last aspect. Fundamentally, all these aspects are directly applicable to the US. Hegemony functions by enforcing colonialist patriarchal ideas on society, ideas that then reveal themselves during times of crisis. Hurricane Katrina is a perfect example of what can happen in such a context. The United States already has demonstrable patriarchal influence in the public sphere. For example, the average American man earns $819 a week, the average woman $657. Also, in the aftermath of any disaster in recent times, be it a financial crisis, a crisis brought on by war, or a natural disaster, the bulk of the suffering is always borne by the most disadvantaged members of society. In this context, in a city whereby, for example, 36.6% of black women were living in poverty, Hurricane Katrina almost represents the perfect storm in terms of the vulnerability of the victims. During the aftermath of 9/11, by and large, the relief effort was presented as a specifically masculine response, almost a reaction against the idea of the pussification of the American man. Whilst the relief effort after 9/11 was infinitely more well coordinated than post-Katrina, there was still an attempt at representing the masculine relief effort as a victory for the American man. The search and rescue effort was widely portrayed as the finest hour of the National Guard. The presence of the military during the relief operation also taps into the notion of the post-9/11 American military narrative, often referred to as military hegemony. As a body, despite now being open to female recruits, the military is a fundamentally masculine body. Therefore, the military presence during the relief missions fundamentally represents an example of the patriarchal narrative in action. A hyper-masculine body, rescuing the helpless, often female, can easily be interpreted as man saving the day, a historically colonial narrative. Any discussion of modern hegemony entails examination of the news media, those who are essentially tasked with creating a narrative. This manifested itself during Katrina. Not only was the hurricane firmly gendered throughout the coverage and referred to in human terms, there was a difference in terms of the treatment of some of the major political figures during the event. Ray Nagin, New Orleans mayor, broke down during a radio interview which was portrayed as him being passionate, whereas when Governor Kathleen Blanco welled up during a press conference, the news media presented this as her being powerless. Furthermore, the gendered nature of a hurricane fundamentally affects the terminology used to react against it, manifesting itself, for example, in firmly misogynist terminology used to describe Katrina, referring to Katrina as variously a bitch, a whore, or making utterly hilarious jokes about Katrina blowing people. The fundamental difference in terms of individual reactions against Katrina compared to, say, Hurricane Andrew highlights a deeply unpleasant misogynist rhetoric in popular discourse. This represents an active exposure of both patriarchal discourse and misogyny in action. Patriarchal or masculine hegemony can be manifested in several manners. Culturally, there is a fundamentally patriarchal undertone to much popular culture, perhaps causing the surrounding narrative of masculine hegemony that appears after any crisis. The cultural issues highlighted by much of the post-Katrina rhetoric highlight some problematic social cleavages within much of US society, but also has a direct impact on the disproportionate suffering of women after any natural disaster.
A natural disaster can be seen to highlight rather than cause the structural inequalities between men and women in the society. Pre-Katrina, women in the New Orleans metropolitan area were already more likely to be single parents, suffer gender violence, be elderly, live in poverty and be reliant on welfare such as public housing. Post-Katrina, these issues were exacerbated by a slow relief effort and a devastated city whose infrastructure as well as buildings had been battered. It is also worth adding that although we focus primarily on gender, it would be disingenuous to ignore the racial divide that dictates the quality of life for American citizens. When Katrina hit in 2004, African Americans were almost 3 times more likely than whites to live in poverty in the United States, and both women and men in New Orleans had poverty rates that were almost double the national average. The way in which Katrina affected the lives of those hit by it was, by and large, dictated by poverty, which is affected by race, gender, or both. In 2004, many more women than men were living in poverty in New Orleans. This pre-existing economic inequality, compounded with the fact that single mothers headed 77% of families in public housing, indicates the level of difficulty many women faced when the storm hit. These factors meant that women were more likely to struggle to evacuate the area or have enough time to prepare themselves properly. The number of older women living in poverty also far exceeded that of men. The unique set of medical, social and financial needs that arise for older people affected more women than it did men. Post-Katrina, the support networks that poorer women depended upon were broken by the storm. 2 years after Katrina, 2/3 of New Orleans' childcare facilities remained closed. Services such as these, that facilitate the lives of single mothers, are often overlooked in the chaos following a disaster. FEMA has been overwhelmingly condemned for a slow reaction, for not providing enough temporary accommodation for victims, and for not understanding the magnitude of the storm. People were forced to sleep on the floors of relatives, on pavements, in cars, and in tents, or were bounced from shelter to shelter, seemingly abandoned by FEMA. Although these failures affected everyone, it meant that vulnerable women were forced into unsafe environments. The result of this was a spike in the prevalence of gender violence. After being provided with temporary accommodation, many women never returned to New Orleans, with the number of African American women decreasing from 47.2% to 37.3%. Women's lives were blown apart, communities broken, people scattered over the United States. It is not just in the USA that women can be seen to be more vulnerable than men following a natural disaster. The world over, women are generally more likely to have dependents, be domestically based, or be reluctant to go to shelters as they can be seen as dangerous places. An extreme example was the Bola cyclone that hit Bangladesh in 1970. It killed 14 women to every man. Disasters tend to reveal developmental failures and societal issues, so inequalities can be compounded and become worse in a disastrous situation. It has also been observed that women turn to alternative support structures rather than those solutions provided by the government like FEMA in their time of need. The church, for example, has been shown as a coping mechanism that can be seen to be more useful to women. A recent study on Hurricane Katrina and religiosity found that religious practices are more deeply ingrained into the social and psychological lives of women and therefore confer greater health benefits. Women have to rely on their own personal support systems that link them to other members of the community and strengthen family bonds rather than governmental ones. The church provides a means of support, psychologically by strengthening a community, and in terms of providing support like childcare. Prayer was cited as a coping mechanism that was revisited again and again. The way in which the church was of importance to so many more women than men after Katrina indicates a lack of support from patriarchal US society. The evidence acts to condemn the way in which society has failed women. Though not this simple, it is often said that men rebuild buildings while women reweave the social fabric of community life.